Good evening, everybody. I'm Alex Nemerov. I'm the chair of the Art and Art History Department. He's losing his voice, but I'm here at Stanford, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, a talk by the photographer Ori Gersht, a talk sponsored by the Contemporary Reading Workshop by the Division of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages here at Stanford, as well as this department, Art and Art History, the Europe Center, and the Taube Center for Jewish Studies. Ori Gersht, whose work I'm looking forward to engaging with more fully as a result of this visit, I've just met him just now, focuses on questions that matter, I think, deeply to many of us here, questions of historical memory, of the strange, unbidden persistence of the past in the present, the particular psychic upset or disturbance that the premonition of the past, if I can put it that way, the feeling of it as though it were still somehow about to take place, causes in us now in this ostensibly historyless era when the past has been seemingly vacuumed up into new degrees and refinements of not existing, yet in which it does go on existing, warping into new forms of non-presence or of fulminating absence that only the chance attunements of the initiated, the specially sensitized, might at moments happen to recover or sense or know. To turn all this into photography, that is no small trick, since as a feeling alone, what I've just described would be difficult to possess or know. But to turn it into works of art would be, or is, Gersht's achievement in travels to the Judean desert, to Sarajevo, Auschwitz, the Galicia region of the Ukraine, and other places where he has portrayed the emotional resonance, call it the ghostliness, of sites of trauma. And having been myself to many American battlefields and relishing the special kind of silence there, Melville called it the after quiet, that obtains at those settings, which paradoxically are actually among the most peaceful places to be in this entire country. Great swards of grass preserved from having been the plots of row upon row of McMansions sheerly by the ungodly destruction that has made them now so sacrosanct. I can readily appreciate, as I hope you will too, Gersht's emphasis on landscape, his engagement with the conventions of that form, and on the special requirements of things like horizons, blades of grass, tufted pentimenti of forgotten battlements and trenches. In this talk, too, I hope we'll say something of friends. And I know for my part, I think of two of them here made vivid for me by simply the occasion of this important talk by this important artist, this person whom I've just only met. And one of these friends is my colleague Nick Jenkins, professor in the English department, who I think I see over there, with whom lately I've taken to comparing notes about two books on trauma, as it happens, trauma such as the kind that Ori Gersht's work addresses, the books both about World War I, being Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel and Edmund Blunden's Undertones of War, so one German, one British. Our comments, Nick and mine, lately falling to, I think you could say, bemused meditations on how truly unfunny Ernst Junger is, unfunny despite how remarkable that book is, and how relatively more humorous in a distinctly dark way is Blunden the Britisher's book. The point being not humor in and of itself, but the relation of humor to sadness, and something that I feel is somehow maybe too little addressed, and which maybe, who knows, we'll hear a bit about tonight. And then second friend, Amir Eshel, professor in the Comparative Literature Department here. Amir, who is the main person who has brought Ori here tonight. Amir, with whom I absolutely agree in our conversations when we have time to meet, that Jonathan Littell's Holocaust novel, The Kindly Ones, is absolutely off the charts, a great book. And Amir, with whom, more importantly, I feel a deep kinship based on just the kind of things we're here to find out about tonight. Questions of absence and of loss and of the historian's way and the artist's way of finding these imperceptible dreams that are somehow not dreams at all, but among the most vividly real things we may be called upon to find. Ori Gersht's talk tonight is called Optical Unconsciousness. Please join me in welcoming Ori Gersht.
Okay, so I want to talk today about particularly these relationships that existing between technologies and representation of the world, and how through the ages new technological development really affect the way um, just one second, the way reality is perceived and understanding of the boundaries. And I particularly want to focus on the 17th century, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and make some sort of analogy to the times that we live in today. And the reason I'm very much interested in these two particular moments, because in both of them there was some sort of eruption or new inventions that really profoundly change the way reality is perceived and affected artists and the way artists represent the world. And I'm very much interested in this because I work in the medium of photography, and there is, it's a medium that is still, there is an aura of certainty around it. As a historical document and historical proof, it's still in court with all this as some sort of evidence. And working with photography, my work is constantly or as a photographer, somebody that keep producing photographic work, I'm constantly having doubt. I'm having doubt at what I see in comparison to what my camera see. I have doubt about anything that I look at in its relationship to the world that is out there. And from it, this relationship of how can I couldn't be sure of anything to be truth. How can I be sure of an historical document? How do I found my moral standing and ground in the world? And I want to start with, like I said, the 17th century and a profound moment where lenses were invented and allow people to see beyond the boundaries of the naked eye. And I want to start with this image looking at Galileo observing the moon and the sky and the stars. And up to this point, people believe that all the planets are heavenly bodies that were perfect, with no indentation in them, and planet Earth was the only one that have all the craters and imperfection, and kind of they are attributed to morality and issues that are concerned with human being. When Galileo looked at the moon through the telescope for the first time, he started to see that there are shadows and light that are affecting the shape of the moon, and from his understanding and art study and understanding of perspective, he started to make those drawings. And in these drawings, we start to see that actually the moon is not perfect. He understands for the first time that there are those craters, and the surface of the moon is not as people assume up to this point. And this had profound repercussion. Of course, then planet Earth started to be conceived also as one of, if the moon is not an heavenly and perfect body, then what are the implications to planet Earth? And the relationship to reality transforming at this point. It's all of a sudden through an understanding, through the mediation of the lens, there is an expansion of the boundaries of what is real and how the real is being perceived. And around the same time, Anthony van Leeuwenhoek in Delft start to develop or master those lenses that allow his telescope to magnify 500 times beyond the ability of the naked eye to see. And he's the first person that managed to observe living organisms through the microscope. I mean, up to this point, people believe that there was a moment of creation where all the living organisms entered the world, and from this point there were no exit. And all of a sudden, Leeuwenhoek started to see these little organisms that moving around, and it's raised all sorts of theological questions about the reason for God creating all these little organisms, what the reason behind it. The implications are huge because painters like Vermeer that were living very close to Leeuwenhoek, and they were affected by his invention, start to paint and start to raise new questions about their methodology. So Vermeer's, there are possibilities that Vermeer actually knew Leeuwenhoek. There is no certainty about this, but when Vermeer died, Leeuwenhoek was involved in dissolving his estate. And in a couple of Vermeer paintings, there is a figure that very much resembling Leeuwenhoek, the scientist and the geographer, and there are the assumption that actually they were close to each other. But what is absolutely clear is that paintings start to change as a result of those discoveries. It's all of a sudden, through the optical development of the lens, people not just can see things that were unavailable before to the naked eye, but also start to understand things about shadows and light, and Vermeer's start to paint. So shadows stop being just dark pitch black, but all of a sudden colors start to emerge in them, and perspectives start to shift as a result of it. I want to kind of move to an image here, so a microscopic image that Leeuwenhoek was when Leeuwenhoek was looking through the microscope and looking at one drop of water, realized that in the single drop of water there were more living organisms than the entire city of Amsterdam. And when I was talking about the relationship between what Leeuwenhoek was seeing and the beliefs up to this point, I saw that this painting by Jan Bruegel the Elder is a kind of a counterpoint, paintings that were created around the same time and showing this kind of Arcadian space, the Garden of Eden, and the moment of creation. So all organisms are perceived more or less within sort of a human proximity in size, and all of a sudden realizing that there is an entire universe that is existing in parallel to human being. So through an understanding or an ability to see the world in ways that were unattainable up to this point, all of a sudden the relationship to the boundaries of reality are transforming. And this is, the questions that are coming with it are fundamental, because when you're thinking about looking through a microscope from the first time, it's not just that people were able to see things that were unattainable before. People have to learn to see the world in ways that were impossible up to this point. Leeuwenhoek himself, when he was looking at human sperm for the first time, he was hoping to see little people. And it took him a long time to understand that what he actually see in front of his eyes were something very different. Here you see through a microscope an image of a maggot. And again, all of a sudden, through the magnification, there is a real transformation. So the ability or the experience that is coming with looking at things for the first time is also demanding a different way of understanding or learning to look. And through this understanding, the relationship with what is real or the boundaries of reality are transforming. I want to move now to a painting that was created just a little bit later by Juan Cotan. And Juan Cotan was a Spanish monk. Actually, he became a monk in a later stage of his life. He was a painter, a successful painter in Toledo. And there was a point where he gave up on all his commercial successful work and moved to the monastery. And from this point onward, all his paintings were done within the boundaries of a monastery and always against the frame of the window of his room. And they're always presenting these tensions that exist between the arch geometry of the window ledge and the organic pattern or arrangement of the object that they capture within the frame. The tension between this parabolic shape of the fruit and the harsh geometries of the concrete and the window. And Cotan was interested in Pythagorean's idea, so you can see the kind of the mathematical rigor of his composition. You start to look at spherical shapes that are deforming as you move along or down the parabolic shape, and not just that they are transformings also in three-dimensional, start to move outside of the plane, and the tensions that exist between the quince and the cucumber, they're really coming to the edge of the frame. So there is a real attempt here to reach almost a sense of equilibrium and a perfect balance of composition. this composition is absolutely static. And one of the things that start to interest me is that in my own work, and when I talk about this kind of technological development, when I looked at the 17th century, when those lenses were invented, they really transformed the relationship of people to the world. The boundaries between the micro and the macro, our position of humans within the world and the representation of it as a result of it changed in a profound way. What interests me now is that I live now in the middle of a digital revolution, and there are all sorts of new inventions that once again are changing completely the relationship with how reality is represented and perceived. When I started doing photography, it was the beginning of the digital revolution. I was working predominantly with analog photography on my second year at university. Photoshop was introduced for the first time, and I was living through this transition where constantly things are changing. And with those changes, there are fundamental thoughts that are emerging about where reality is existing and what the relationship of photography with it. And what was interesting interests me when I looked at this Cohen's work, and I started to think about it and eventually produce this work that I titled Pomegranate, is a desire to create works that on the one hand is coming from art history and very deeply connected to Cohen, but at the same token presenting a moment that was unattainable to him, a moment that is only possible to perceive with the introduction of new technologies. And on the other side of the so on the other side of the curve, I was looking at the work of Edgerton that worked at MIT and developed the stroboscopic photography or the high-speed photography. And I was very much interested in an event that happened in a speed that is unattainable to us, an event that become available to us only through the use of new technology. And with this technology, somehow we managed to enter the folds of time and experience a moment that was impossible for people at the time of Cohen to explore. And then the question is, where reality is really occurring? Does it occur in our empirical experiences, or our new technologies are constantly opening and reshaping these? And I would like to move now to a little bit further in art history and move to a painting that was created by Goya, the 3rd of May, one of the most iconic historical paintings. And I'm very much interested in this painting, and particularly in the relationships that Goya had. Allegedly, Goya was there when the painting was created. He was a physical, a bare witness of the event. Although the painting itself was finished 6 years after the event took place, so he completed the painting in 1814. Goya was horrified by what had happened there, and he created this historical painting. It's one of the last painting of this genre, and it has many of the of the assets and the feature of historical painting. It's very large in scale. It's a very dramatic painting. It happened, the lighting of the painting, the protagonist is lit by artificial light, white figure crucified. We have the entire narrative unfolding in the painting. So we have the troops, the Napoleonic troops that are about to execute the victim. We have the horrified crowds that are standing at the side and already anticipating what is about to happen. There are the dead bodies on the floor that show the horror, the after effect. So the entire narrative here is unfolding. The circular motion of the composition, they're all kind of taking us into a particular moment. Now the question is, and I want to move to another painting that was created a few years later there were a few versions of it, but let's talk about 1865, the execution of Maximilian. And this is an event that happened in Mexico, again involving Napoleonic troop and the execution of Maximilian the Emperor by Mexican troops. Manet produced this painting, and it's obvious that Manet was influenced by Goya, and we see many aspects that are very closely related to the Goya painting. Once again, Maximilian is dressed in white and is in the position of being crucified. We have the troops that are focusing the guns, but there is something here that is profoundly different, and the painting here is less dramatic, and we don't have a full narrative that is unfolding here. Actually, there is some aspect of these paintings that are almost disconcerting. There is a figure here, one of the guards, that is caught at the moment of unawareness, where he's cleaning his own, or looking in his own gun, or checking his own gun. And the main focus of this painting is actually the smoke that is coming out of the barrel. And the gap between these two paintings, or something profound happened between the creation of these two paintings. So one was created in 1814, and the second one is in 1865 or 1867. Between these two moments, in 1839, between these two moments, in 1839, Degas invented the medium of photography. And I have a sort of conviction that the understanding of this moment, or the digestion of this moment, really affected the way Manet created his painting. And what Manet is producing in his painting now, it's also kind of interesting to think about the fact that Manet was not witnessing the event when it happened in Mexico. Manet only heard about it in the news and saw images. This is the shirt of Maximilian after the execution. So he produced his painting on the basis of what he saw, and on images that he saw and what he heard, unlike Goya, that was allegedly a bare witness of the event. But what also interesting is that when Manet was looking at the painting, he was able to start to think about new possibilities of capturing a reality that was maybe unattainable to Goya. Photography at the time still was technologically undeveloped, but the proposition of what the photograph will be able to do in the future was already, I assume, conceptually in the back of his mind, and Manet was able to try and capture a moment of a smoke leaving the barrel, a moment that the bullet was leaving the gun, a moment that is capturing Maximilian at the moment, at the fraction between life and death, where he is neither in one position nor in the other. Where Goya's painting are depicting the entire narrative and show the dead bodies on the ground, Manet is capturing a moment that is really a suspension, a moment that somebody is hanging between those two, between these two moments, a paradoxical moment that the photograph can actually reveal. And just to make a comparison to the Manet painting, I want to look at another photograph that was created around the same time. This is Roger Fenton here, that was sent to the Crimean War. And when Fenton was sending in 1855 to the Crimean War, he was actually was briefed to depict the war in such a way that will sway the public opinion in Britain, because there was all kind of suspicions and dissatisfaction about the war. So Fenton was briefed to bring back images that are more sympathetic of the war, but also Fenton was facing some technical insufficiency that forced him to photograph in a particular way. So when you look at Fenton photograph, there are hardly ever any figures in them, and there is no movement. And one of the main reasons for this is because the technology that Fenton was using, he was using wet collodion plate at the time, and therefore he was required to follow very long exposures. So if figures were moving through the frames, they will evaporate and become ghosts. So Fenton often captured images of battlefield after the event. So we have the cannonballs on the floor here that are representing the event that took place. This is a very bloody battle in the valley, the shadows of death. And what's interesting when we think about this photograph in relation to the Manet paintings, that the Manet painting is talking about what photography will be able to deliver. It talks about the possibility, the conceptually possibility, but the technology was still not there. So Fenton, using the medium of photography, can still not deliver what potentially the new possibilities that a photograph, that Manet can already start to comprehend. And this relationship between our new technological shift is opening the door for new possibilities of capturing or thinking about reality or representing reality, was even pushed further years later when Robert Capa in 1936 was photographing the civil war in Spain. And he was able to run with the troops and follow the events as they unfold. So the invention of 35mm photography and films that were a lot more sensitive all of a sudden make another shift. And Capa was able to photograph a moment here that similar in its appearance to the Manet painting and to the Goya painting. Once again, we have the figure dressed in white, crucified at the moment of execution. But what is interesting about what Capa is doing is that the moment that the event or the moment that he managed to capture is even pushing the boundaries further. So here we see a person not at the moment where the bullet traveling in the air and about to penetrate his body, but we see somebody at the moment that the bullet is actually entering. And this person is just suspended between two moments of life and death. This person is actually neither alive nor dead, or simultaneously alive and dead. Later, people figure out that probably this photograph was composed and there are possibilities that actually everything was fabricated, but I don't think that this is the point. What is really crucial here is that Capa, through the development of new technologies, were able to capture a moment that create a paradox to our mundane experience of the world. To see somebody that simultaneously in two states, alive and dead simultaneously. This is somehow resonating to quantum physics and to Heisenberg theory of uncertainty, when Schrödinger was challenging Heisenberg and saying that a particle cannot be in two places simultaneously. A particle must be either here nor there, and Schrödinger was coming with the analogy of the live cat on the dead cat, and he said, well, a particle can either be here or there, and when you think about it, if you take a cat and you put it inside a box and you release cyanide into the box, there will be a point where the cat will either be alive or dead. And the only way to assess this is to lift the lid and to look. Here, photography all of a sudden representing a moment that is simultaneously, somebody is being caught at a moment where time seems to collapse upon itself. A moment where we see a paradox that impossible for us to experience in our mundane reality, but through new technology, because of the speed, and this moment is captured and being frozen to eternity. In 2007, I produced a body of work that I titled Time After Time, that started to explore a relationship that I discussed when I showed the film of the pomegranate between old master work and contemporary practice. And what interests me is, once again, to work with this relationship between moments from the past, the foundation that formed my entire cultural upbringing, my pictorial understanding of the world, and also affected the pictorial design of the camera and so forth, but actually represent moments that were incomprehensible to the old masters that produced them in the 18th century. And I was particularly interested in the Dutch still life because of a narrative that was evolving around them, and the historical narrative was the first trigger that led me to produce this work. One of the things that I particularly was attracted to is the use of tulip in these works that start to arrive to Holland around this period of time and became a great object of desire. This was a moment of transformation, and exotic flowers start to enter Europe. The great desire to attain them created a sort of an economic bubble. People start to invest not just in the flower, but to assure that they get the best flowers. They start to buy or speculate on buying bulbs before the flower blossoming. And by doing this, they start to spend loads and loads of money on those bulbs. So a good bulb will cost something like 3,000 gulden at the time, when a painting like this by Bouchard will cost only 300 gulden. And eventually this created bubbles that burst and brought all the Dutch economy into a halt. And this sort of historical and political narrative kind of tie me to this particular work, and I start to explore it. And what I was interested in is to start to follow the composition of the original painting, but rather than attempting to mimic them, to understand element in the composition and then to develop them into original compositions that are bearing all those aspects in mind. So all the composition were quite vertical, with a little bit more weight toward the bottom. I tried to identify all the flowers that we use in them and so forth. But the moment that we capture here, and what I was attempting to photograph, is once again these tensions that exist, so a paradox that exists between two moments, the moment of destruction and the moment of creation. But not just this, when the two are somehow collapsing upon themselves. I wanted to capture a moment where time seems to fold upon itself. So we see simultaneously the moment of destruction, but at the same time the vase is still holding together. It's already gone, and this moment of transient, when something is captured, neither here nor there, a moment that photography is always trying to battle with. There is a great desire in every photographic image to capture something and turn it into eternal, almost to arrest it. What interests me is that in all these photographs that I produce, I'm trying to capture moments that is transient, and it's already gone. The moment that that the camera is engaging with it is the moment that's really passing away, and it's passing away in such a speed that it's presenting itself in ways that it's almost metaphysical. Moments that we can never encounter in our mundane reality, and all of a sudden coming to life. And then there is a gap between what the camera sees and what one can actually experience. After producing the Time After Time series, I wanted to push this exploration a little bit further and to try to capture an event like this, but with such acute sharpness that will present and allow the viewer to experience information beyond the ability of the naked eye. And I started to look at work by Henri Fontaine-Latour from the 19th century. What really attracted it to this painting, and this painting, like the ones I showed you before, are all part of the National Gallery collection in London, which I visit on a regular basis, is that there was a period in Fontaine-Latour's work where the palette was restricted to the red, blue, and white. And on the one hand, Fontaine-Latour was a very bourgeoisie painter with great facilities, and I really was fascinated by the sort of nationalistic discourse that was embedded in these works, and I wanted to work with those. So I started to follow the composition of Fontaine-Latour. In particular, I paid attention to those three colors that became kind of the essence of the work. And in the studio, created similar composition. Then, after creating the work, I froze them with liquid nitrogen, detonated into them, and exploded them. These photographs were taken at a phenomenal speed of 10,000th of a second. And once again, there is a gap between what Fontaine-Latour was painting, or what old masters were looking at, and the realities that I was capturing, realities that become available to me through the use of new technology. as if the camera is able to capture a time, and once again I'll use this term, a time that is metaphysical, a time that doesn't really exist in my mundane reality, and all of a sudden through new technology become available and expanding the possibility of what reality is. Actually, the whole relationship here with the camera is no longer recording the world, but the camera is creating a world that does not exist outside this remit, and this moment only existing if I believe in the technologies that creating it, because I have no means to assess this moment and to be sure that anything that I'm looking at actually occur. But because of the great power of the camera here to the suspension of these beliefs it created, I kind of accept this image without any doubt, although I was standing there at the moment of creation and could not see any of those events. So when I made this photograph, and it was very important actually that all these works were created with digital cameras, because I wanted them, on the one end, in terms of appearance, to be as close as possible to painting and to the history of painting, but in the means of creating the work to be as removed as possible. If thinking about painting as the most visceral and sensual medium, that every brushstroke has a physical presence in the world, so standing in front of the Goya painting and feeling the presence of the painter there, and the tactility and sensuality of the material. When I moved later to analog photography, analog photography became a step removed. There is still the materiality of the film, the celluloid, the silver halides that are being affected by light, and the image is created in a way that can still be tangible and attainable. When I start to move into the digital world, then all materiality is dissolved, and I work really in the realm of abstraction. The image becomes a simulation of a photograph or a visual mediums that I was familiar with, but was created. Still, everything is kind of based on related optic, but the actual process goes through some sort of mathematical mediation. So, on one end, the proximity, and the other end, the distance, and then the reality that is presented. What was important to me in this work, unlike the small works of the time after time, is not just to capture an event in enormous speed, but also capture a moment with such acute attention to detail that when approaching this photograph, I wanted the viewers to constantly be able to get more and more out of the image. There won't be a point of exhaustion. So even coming very close to the image, there are more information that reveal. There will be points in them that will reveal details that the naked eye cannot perceive. So when you come and you see the butterfly, there you see the air on the wing of the butterfly, and the closer you get to the image, there is something more, as if an onion is constantly peeling and peeling. And I also wanted to pack these images with so much information, so it's almost impossible to digest it. To have this, to work with this tendency of the camera, or a certain arrogance that photography had about the ability almost to retain and remember infinite number of details simultaneously. One of the issues that I often had with photography is that when I look, unlike paintings, that the surface seems to constantly feed more and more, and whenever I stand in front of the painting, it never seems to exhaust itself. Often with photography, I come to the image, and after I know it, I have a feel of familiarity and understanding that doesn't require me to come back to it. And I wanted to work with, to create images here that the level of information will be so dense that the viewer will never be able to digest it. That at every experience there are new possibilities that are creating. These photographs are representing moment of extreme violence that is disguised behind this kind of exuberant, colorful, almost celebration. And for me, the tension that exists between this moment of violence and beauty, as if beauty becoming a disguise and creating a layer that preventing from the viewer to be, or the viewer is not confronted, but was a look at, but can almost be hidden behind, and also a moment that is or a tension that exists here, sort of a dialectical tension that exists in the work between the moment of destruction and the moment of creation. Actually, the act of destruction becomes the moment where the photograph or the image is being created. And the tension and the kind of the paradox between those two forces is essential for the way this work is being created. It actually took me some time to reflect on this moment. And I was brought up in Israel, and I went through a period of suicide bombers in buses, and part of the day-to-day experiences that I was living through. And many of these images are somehow resonating in my work, often without even me reflecting upon them, and take me some time to all of a sudden recognize this moment of standing in front of the photograph and making associations that were not clear at all. So, I mean, now, of course, when I talk about it, I can reflect on this moment, but the relationship to the image often starts as some sort of an intuitive response rather than a clear analysis. I want to show you here the process of making this work. And in order to capture the moment of explosion and to capture it with so much detail, I had to work with the best digital cameras that were available. And the problem with these cameras was that they were only capture 1 frame per second. And in order to capture an event that's happening at 10,000th of a second, I had to build a whole bank of cameras with a computer device that will trigger the cameras one after another. So what I've done is I took 10 Hasselblad cameras and I built a rig. Now the rig had to be very, very concentrated toward the center in order to retain the original composition of the painting. So every camera had to look at the painting or at the object from a central vantage point. And then, in order to get the cameras to fire close to each other, we created this electronic device that firing them at 400 of a second apart, with the desire to capture at least with 1 camera the event at the moment of its occurrence. So first the composition was created with the flowers. We had to create 1 bouquet after another. And then the flowers were taken to the studio, to the stage, and I worked with a group of pyrotechnic experts, and slowly the explosive devices were weaved into the flower, which at this point became very volatile. And then we have to move out of the set, and I dropped from the sky. I created this polystyrene box that was hanging on a pulley system, and the polystyrene box was brought from the top, very slowly opened up and closed around the flowers, and then liquid nitrogen was sprayed upon the flower for a period of about 10 minutes until they were properly brittle and frozen. And then very carefully the box had to be lifted up. And we had a system where as soon as the trigger of the camera was pressed, the electronic device was firing all the cameras one after the other, including the flash, with the desire to capture at least with one of the cameras the event at the moment of its occurrence. This approach is very much related to the work that Edward Muybridge was creating many years ago in the beginning of cinema, where Muybridge was working with a bank of cameras that were triggered by strings. As soon as the horse was running, then every step will pull another string, another camera will fire, and Muybridge was able to capture actual movement as it occurred. This discovery by Muybridge, again, had a profound impact on the understanding of realities and understanding of the world. So a technological device that, once again, kind of shift the relationship with how reality is perceived. Up to this point, people believe when a horse was running, his entire legs were at one point in the air at the moment of stretching out, which was the graceful moment in the horse's galloping. But actually, there was a bet that Muybridge was kind of proving or providing the proof for, and Muybridge actually shows that it was true that 4 legs of the horse were in the air, but actually at the moment of contraction. And this has implications. So painters like Degas start to paint differently, and all of a sudden, through a technological device, the relationship with our reality is represented. Now, the reason I'm kind of so much interested in how technology affecting the way reality is represented is this question that constantly are popping up when I make work is where or how do I know that anything that I look at is actually true, and how do I form my relationship to truth as a photographer and as a consumer of images. I want to move now to another body of works that I produced in 2014. And this body of work, once again, coming back to the flowers and looking at 3 paintings that were created by Jan Bruegel the Elder, and all 3 of them are hanging in the Kunsthistorius in Vienna. I came across this painting, and I had a fascination with Bruegel for a long time. One of the things that Bruegel is one of the pioneers of this genre, and these paintings were created at the beginning, again, of the 17th century, the beginning of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and there was a real shift here. So all of a sudden, wild flowers completely disappeared from all the composition, and not just this Jan Bruegel creating an illusion that he was sitting in front of a bouquet, but it was not true because the flowers that represented in those paintings are from different time of the year. He painted them individually and created this composition together. And not just this, it was the beginning of imperialism. So flowers start to arrive to Europe from all parts of the world, and flowers that could not exist in the same bouquet all of a sudden becoming unified. This is also the beginning of horticulturalism. So every flower that exists here could not exist without botanical and human intervention. So this painting on the one hand representing a very naturalistic view, but are actually capturing a moment that was impossible for them, or didn't really exist, but the painter created it. And this relationship that exists between the authenticity on the moment and the creation of it was a kind of the starting point. And I decided to keep working with this moment and actually recreate those 3 compositions in the studios, but all from synthetic materials. So everything is becoming even further removed from the natural world. And not just this, in order to remove them even further, I put them in front of mirrors. So what you see here is not the actual flowers, but it's a reflection of the flowers in the mirror. So there is further and further step of removal from the there-ness, for the tangible, from appearance of things and of the world. And then in order to photograph them, I created an entire studio made out of mirrors. So when I affect these flowers, they are in some sort of kaleidoscopic space. And I'll just show you the space that we created for the photograph. So the flowers themselves are standing beside the mirror, and the camera is standing by the flowers, looking at the mirror. And at the moment of exploding the mirror, it was very important to create this sort of kaleidoscopic space. This moment of exploding the mirrors, fragments of the mirror start to fly throughout the space. And as soon as they fly throughout the space, then they move out of control and they start to reflect in 360 degrees everything that around them. So some fragment will start to reflect the ceiling, some reflect the floor. So unless I create an hermetic enclosed space, then it will be impossible for me to create a multiple layer of reflection. So we build this space, and after building the space, I took 2 cameras and I placed the 2 cameras beside each other. The 2 cameras were looking at the same thing. Both were looking at the reflection, at the mirrors that was standing in front of the flowers. But each camera had a different focusing point. So both cameras were about 3 meters away from the object. one camera was focusing on the surface of the mirror itself. So you see the red light there. The second camera was focusing on the reflection of the flower in the mirror. Now these are two distinctly different points. So I was facing the glass of the mirror. This was the only tangible object that I was looking at. But the second camera was actually looking not at the mirror itself, but looking through the surface into the virtual space, the space of the reflection. Every morning when we look at ourselves in the mirror, because the image that is projected in the mirror is so seductive, we overlook the object, the glass itself. And the virtual image that is created in front of us becoming more powerful. Not just this, the image is so seductive and also so deceptive that we always see ourselves the other way around, and we have an understanding or an image of ourselves in such way, although we perceive by other in reverse to how we conceive ourselves. So as I put the camera, I try to capture simultaneously a situation that happened at the moment of explosion. So one camera is capturing the reflection in the mirror. And what you start to have when you look at the reflection in the mirror is you start to have moments that are creating a real paradox, because they have a single piece of mirror that captured the perspective in a correct or in a correct pictorial way. As soon as the mirror breaks up, I have 100 pieces of mirrors that start to fly into space. And each piece of mirror may reflect the same flower. So all of a sudden, the same flower, like the red peony, appearing 7 or 8 times in the same frame. Now, this is a sort of a paradox that the same piece can appear at the same moment in different places. The entire space is start to break down, but we don't see any of the glass itself, because the glass itself is out of focus. The camera is looking so deep. So, as I say, when you look at yourself in the mirror, if the mirror is only half a meter away from us, the glass, but our reflection will be the distance to the mirror and double it. So the focusing point will be 1 meter into the virtual space. The camera will focus into something that doesn't exist anywhere. The mirror itself is only 50 centimeters. Here the gap was of 3 meters. So the glass was 3 meters away from me. The reflection was 6 meters. So when I was focusing on the reflection itself, the glass completely disappeared as if it's not there, and we're looking at an image as if unmediated, an image that doesn't really exist in the world, only appear as a virtual reflection. The second camera was looking at the glass itself. So it's capturing the same event, exactly same event, but in a profound different way. So here the flowers start to drift out of focus, but the image is very, very sharp, because every piece of glass here is, I have a single plane. So actually the focus here, there is no depth of field. It's absolutely as sharp as it could be, and I'll show you a close-up image of it. So the two cameras are looking at the same thing, but capturing parallel reality. One captures the reality of the material itself, and the second is capturing the virtual reality that coexisting. And as if there is a sort of a dichotomy or tension that exists between those two moments, as if they cannot be coincided. There is the virtual and the material that all of a sudden being separated here. And I was interested in this relationship, so I started to talk earlier on about the moments where the telescope and the microscope were invented through lenses, and now all of a sudden through optic there is an extension to the naked eye, and we can start to conceive a world that is existing out of our limits, and through a conscious understanding of this world, through vision, all of a sudden the boundaries of what is real are expanding. And now we're looking at a time where we are surrounded by virtual images that are flooding into our consciousness in such pace with so much conviction, so we can see an event that happened in another part of the world at the moment of its occurrence, and the moment is so convincing that we can no longer make distinction, and we perceive this image as something that happened, although we have no certainty whatsoever of this moment. So there is a tension that exists constantly that I feel experiencing every moment of my life of touching an object and looking at it, and then perceiving virtual images that are entering my consciousness, and the mesh between the two of them are creating some sort of a reality, and as a result, my moral understanding and position of the world is being formed. And in all these bodies of work, when I looked before at the exploding flower, the object itself that is shattering at a speed that is incomprehensible, here I wanted to move to a different space where the camera is making a distinction or making a separation between the virtual and the material world, as if they can never be coincided. They're becoming two separate entities, two separate planes that are being observed, absorbed and observed as a single event. And then I did a film about this moment. And in the film, what I tried to do is I tried to put the two cameras beside each other and film simultaneously the event with the two different focusing points. So one camera was looking at the mirror and the other the reflection, and I put the two together so the space that is created is between the virtual and the material. And one of the things that interests me in this moment is that the material, the glass itself, that has materiality, that has weight to it and mass, as soon as an explosion takes place, is falling downward because the force of gravity works on it. But the virtual images that are reflected in the mirror at this point start to somehow elevate and fly, go up into actually in all sorts of different directions, because I kind of in my head, the images with no mass. So gravity does not work, and all of a sudden the space that is created is a space that has no linearity to it. So the images start to move in all sorts of directions and doesn't have a clarity of a beginning and an end to them. Once again, the event is filmed at an extraordinary speed of about 2,500 frames per second. So every second in real life is becoming around a minute and a half on film. So what time start to do here is start to stretch up in a way. So it's not just that we are looking at space that is a mashup of the virtual and the material world, but we're also experiencing something in time that we cannot comprehend. So the whole event is happening in a space that is outside our remit, and at the same time, a space that we're absolutely living in. I mean, it's just when I think about a live transmission of television where I sit and I can watch a basketball game that happen in the United States when I'm in London at the real time and experience the same or very similar experience to somebody who sit in the arena and completely be absorbed in the moment and not being able to distinguish. When I reflect on my life and my experiences of the day, there is no longer separation between the two. I can no longer understand or be able to figure out which moment or how each moment enter into my consciousness, how my anxiety are being formed, how my understanding of the world is being formed, how my moral standing as a result of it. I mean, the reason they say I kind of run the film forward and backward is because of this collapse of linearity. We're looking at a space where things are moving in all sorts of trajectories, and as some pieces of glass are falling down, we get an idea of images that of some of the images of the flowers. The reflection seems to go against it, and there is no clarity to where something started and where something ended. Everything could move in all sorts of direction. And this idea of perceiving time as in a linear way, or understanding how space is being crushed and collapsed upon itself is I mean, I don't think that there can be a better example than looking at some of those NASA's images of deep space, where a camera was standing outside of the atmosphere, so there won't be any UV pollution, and start to photograph an image over a period of 7 years, and slowly capturing, and as light is entering the sensor, things opening up, and we start to look at things that are not just so far away that when we talked about Galileo earlier on and the ability of new technology to open up the possibility of what reality is and changing our relationship with it, to look so far away and to see things not just in a distance, but also things at a different time, events that happened by the time we see them millions and millions years before. And this relationship that start to collapse, or the collapse of space and time upon themselves, and the way new technologies start to present reality is becoming so disorientating that the virtual, I believe, can no longer be distinctive from the material. So they are becoming one. And to think about a photograph as a representation of the world is becoming almost redundant, because the photograph or the virtual image is becoming the world, and they are part of the reality, and somehow engaging with it in a new experience that can never be, or that can no longer be distinguished. In order to kind of explore this, I went to Japan last year, and I photographed around some of the gardens in Kyoto, and I continue to develop ideas that I worked on in the on-reflection work, where the virtual and the material were separated but existed or coincided within one another. In this body of work, what I attempted to do is to create images where the relationship between the virtual and the material can no longer be distinguished, as if one is collapsing upon each other. And I photograph in many of the Buddhist temples. I particularly looked at gardens that are surrounding the pond, and those reflected ponds were created for those very reasons. In Zen culture, the relationship that exists between reality and appearance, between the physical experience and the image, was explored in various ways. What I try to do in all these photographs is to capture a moment where no one can no longer make a distinction between what the virtual is and what the material is, as if they are melting down and becoming a universal or a unified space. So in some of the photographs, and in each photograph in this series, I approach slightly differently in order to create a continuous relationship that will challenge myself and the viewers to the relationship of where one starts and when one finishes. So this photograph, for example, of a reflection of the sky in the water, the images themselves are turned upside down. So the skies that are reflected in the water all of a sudden are coming back to the natural place and occupy the water of above. And in many ways, the space here is collapsing, or there is a real compression of the space. And what you start to see here is part of the elements of the real waves that are growing from the water are reflecting in the water. And because of the positioning of the camera, the perspective of the camera, and the disappearance of the horizon, there is no, the actual objects themselves seems to be flattened into their own reflection. and then you have the branches that are coming in the horizontal, and they're coming from a different plane, and the three together seems to crush upon each other and created a space that appeared to be absolutely flat and no longer possible to make any distinction between the elements that are reflected and the elements that are real. In some of the photographs, I actually turn them upside down and put them upon each other, so there is a complete compression or mash up between the reflected and the real, and one is appearing within the other rather than in opposition or contrast to the other. I would like to show you now just another film that is outside of my presentation. One of the things that interests me is, again, thinking about the invention of the lens and how the relationship between this moment of when the lens was invented, how it profoundly changed the way the world is perceived, the way painters are representing the world, and the way we start to understand it and expanding upon our perception of reality. I try to make a film where I start to look at a single drop of water that working as a lens itself, an ephemeral lens that in the 17th century was that created now an experience that in the 17th century was impossible to be comprehended. And I like this idea that I look at the drop of water as a natural lens that is passing through time and can never be held on to, but with new technology, I can actually look through it and the world reveal itself. So I took these two paintings. Actually, I was commissioned to do it by a Swiss couple that, it's a shame that we can't get any of the sound here, but this couple were their ancestors, and they moved into the house where the couple were living at the time, and they wanted somehow to kind of bring the painting into the space. What I tried to do in this work is to look at the painting in two different ways, as a macro and a micro. So I started to look at the painting reflecting in the water, and there is a single drop that's falling into the water and started this act of disruption. And the portrait seems to somehow almost resurrect and coming back to life and start to develop this dialogue between them. But then I tried to move from the macro into the micro and start to look at the single drop of water itself. So rather than looking at the effect of the drop, the camera started to look right into the drop and see the world from this perspective. So there is the dual perspective of the micro and the macro that in some way relating to the relationship between the virtual and the material world, how these two perspectives of the same things are providing a completely different experience. And I keep coming to this idea of the multiple perspective, and I think that it has some sort of connection to, again, my upbringing in Israel, and to a sort of a perspective or an historical narrative that I was brought up believing in as an absolute perception and understanding of the past. And it took me a long time to start to pull myself out of this, and moving to live in London was, I suppose, a very critical moment of taking a different vantage point and start to conceive multiple narratives that are coexisting, and actually how important is the vantage point, because each one of the narrative, of course, is making sense and is absolutely true as long as you have a faith and believe in it. As soon as you start to doubt any of those narratives, none of them is bounding itself in solid reality. And I think that a lot of the work that I'm doing, this relationship between the virtual and the material, this idea of the double perspective, the relationship between the two moments of creation and destruction, moments that are collapsing and colliding upon themselves, moments where the camera is no longer I don't perceive the camera as a recording of the world, but as a creating. The act of photography is an act of manipulation where it presents a reality that couldn't exist outside of it. Is very much at the heart, I think, of those, I suppose, political and moral concerns that I'm living through in relation to my biographical past. I think that I'll stop here. I'll let the film run, and if anyone wants to ask any question, I'll be more than willing to answer.
So, do you have other ideas about how you're going to change it, the finished product, and other projects you want to do throughout the course of creating a finished product, or did you, in general, have an idea and then just go through with the execution of it?
Everything is organically evolving, and it's usually through mistakes and unpredictable encounters that things are coming to life. I mean, I often start with a particular image and in my head, but it has no relation to the final outcome. My work is kind of shifting. I focus today on particular works that are exploring relationship between our technologies and our photograph through the mediation of technologies, engaging with the world and kind of somehow trying to represent or define what is real or what is happening outside of our kind of empirical or ability to experience the world, or essential ability to experience the world. Some of my work is very intimate, and I just go on my own and work in a very different way. When I worked on this sort of work, there is a whole team involved, and often the teams that I'm collaborating with are coming from the commercial world, and in the commercial world, the relationship between the brief and the outcome are very tight. So there will be a great desire from those people, like the special effects people, already to know what it's going to look like. And I tend to resist it because I want the process or the making of the work to be an act of discovery rather than of reassurance. So it tends to start with the idea, and all sorts of people will try to force a way toward a solution. Often what I do is I create new problems. So until we come to the shoot, everyone needs to deal with the new problems that are occurring, so no one can settle into a particular way of doing this. And on very many occasions, when I do those shoots, I actually have to focus on one day for the single shoot itself. There is a lot of preparation to build up for it, figuring out what we're going to do and how I'm going to do it. And then there is a long process of understanding what was done and how to process it and how to realize it. So in the actual shoot itself, what tends to happen is that we spend at least the first half of the day not succeeding in anything. And often there is a lot of anxieties that start to build up, and I have a tendency to try and project upon the teams that as kind of some sort of confidence and assurance that we'll find a way, and that I trust their abilities, and I suppose that they are feeding in similar way by me, and I'm always hoping that there will be a moment of eureka, or something will happen. In a romantic way, I kind of almost want to believe in a mystical moment where the mistake and the chance and our sort of professional experience will meet together, and something will happen. And on many occasions, it's even difficult to know what had happened, because things are happening at an enormous speed during the shoot, and a lot of the preoccupation is to make sure that we don't do any kind of really big technical mistake. So there are a lot of things to deal with, and somehow you have to go through the motion. So a lot of the realization come later when I actually start to review the footage and to work with what I have rather than what I wanted it to be. And unless I manage to make this transition and completely let go of my initial ideas, I think that the work is lacking. It has to somehow to become, and it's always kind of strange because you talk about the work, so you reflect on what is there, but it's very, very removed from the actual process of making it, where most of the thing I don't know. It's kind of, it starts from an intuitive desire and some sort of faith or trust in something that seems to make sense at the time, and then go through various filtering processes, and if it passes those barriers, then it becomes works that I'll exhibit and show. Yes.
One of the uncertainties that I think your work reveals to me is I think back on like the photograph of Maximilian's shirt, and it's hard not to think of it in slow motion now as he was wearing it. And although that's absurd in one sense, it also makes sense to think of somehow you've liberated that shirt from its static, that photograph from its static nature. And I don't know what is real and what is virtual when I contemplate that shirt now. So there's a way that you reveal the latent metaphysics of, embedded in earlier conceptions of, it would seem, the here and now, the straightforward, the declarative.
I think that for me it's really interesting, the relationship between Manet's painting and this photograph, because Manet is trying to capture the moment in its becoming, and the photograph, like he said, it's a static virtual image, and you have to imagine the presence of the figure that was wearing the shirt, and there is a real gap there that Manet kind of conceptually is addressing through a virtual image of the world that is actually has a lot of similarity, I suppose, to many of my encounters today with current affairs, events that I kind of see as virtual images, and somehow have a tendency to internalize and almost own as part of the realities that I'm experiencing.
It seems like what's going on in a lot of your work is the working out of paradoxes. Paradoxes being things that you can somehow think about but are really hard to kind of experience in the world. It's kind of impossible in that way. And it seems, is it right to say that you're using the camera to kind of demonstrate to us, make literal or make available to us something that is paradoxical and just cannot otherwise be seen or experienced?
Yeah, I think that I would say that there is an element of uncertainty. I work with a medium that on its face it's the most certain. There is holding a photograph of somebody I knew that died, and the presence of them there, or of an historical event, or an evidence of a place that I've been to. There is something about photography that is so assuring, and there is something I think that I always feel that whenever I'm sure about something, immediately I start to develop doubt in it. And I think that what I'm interested in photography is trying to capture things that are actually falling between these places. I mean, in the landscape photograph, when traveling from, for example, from Krakow to Auschwitz, and this desire to photograph from the window and hold on to something that was actually there. And I'm holding the camera at 90 degrees to the window, so as soon as something, I had a waist level analog camera, and as soon as something was appearing, it was already disappearing, so I was trying to capture it and it was already gone. And actually through this journey I was sweating, and it was near the beginning of my trip, and I nearly ran off all films because I couldn't stop, because I said I have to capture something, and I couldn't. And I was cursing myself because I knew that if I stuck without film, and I'm in the middle of Poland, this was in 1999, and there is no way for me to get more film, so what I'm going to do? But I couldn't stop, and when I arrived to my studio and went to the darkroom and started to process this film, I realized that something more interesting occurred, because the fact that I was trying to hold on to something, and I was constantly missing, and the images that I captured seems to slide off the film, was very much about the gap between my psychological state and the desire to hold on to something, and the inability of the photograph to capture anything. And I think that this gap, it's going throughout my work, and I have a great desire to hold on to something that is certain in the world. I want to I want my moral standing in the world to be certain, to know that whatever I believe in is truth, that I'm kind of striving so as something that has some sort of tangibility, and I know that it's always going to fall apart, that it's impossible. So I have to let it go as soon as I'm, and there is, I'm not sure if my initial stage of taking the camera and starting to photograph things, and I experienced loss at a fairly young age, and this kind of desire to resist it with the camera, and a certain understanding that only when I let those things go, I can somehow redeem myself. So I think that it's come from those sort of places of striving for certainty and for a real understanding, clear understanding, and hoping that the camera can deliver it, and constantly it falls apart. And that's why I was interested, so we talk about Manen, there is the Goya painting, he was bear witness, but actually it took him 6 years to produce the painting, and it became this kind of a long experience of production that is somehow related to a real experience that he had, but you end up with a painting that's becoming an accumulative experience of over time of the making of, and those sort of gaps that are existing. I think that this is one of the kind of the areas that I constantly find myself falling into. Yes.
So you talk a lot about the ideal and the virtual and the material, and it strikes me that all of your work I've seen sort of projected on a screen. I was wondering if you still have an attachment to analog photography and the physical print. Do you make books or prints, or think about sort of how your work is projected or displayed as, exuding light or...
So I think about it all the time, and it's I always envy painters, and I'm always missing this central experience of a surface that exists in a painting. And whenever I'm thinking about producing painting, I find myself going back to photography, because I find that the relationship that photographic images to the world we live in today is so acute that to explore the idea that I want with photography is the right medium, and I'm kind of constantly torn apart between these two. And I have a great desire to experience photograph not as information, but as a central object. So I never frame my photo. I frame them, but I never use a glaze on top of them. And I tend to use this sort of a silicon seal. I want to create a surface tension, which doesn't exist, because every photograph by essence is a virtual image. It's appear on a piece of paper, and there is no surface to it. It's happening somehow on the paper, in a place that doesn't really exist. And it's one of the frustrations that I have with experienced photograph very often. So when I stand in front of a Goya, I can stand forever, and somehow something keep radiating from the surface that can never be digested. It's just constantly coming in as if like a fountain, kind of spewing more and more. And my great desire is to create a photograph that is coming from the virtual, but actually coming to the surface, which is an impossibility, but coming to the surface in such a way that will provide with a central experience. So the way you engage with it is not through an information, but it's something that is a desire to touch it, a desire to come close to it, and somehow to have a physical relationship with it as an object. And I
think it's wonderful that our eyes are actually very central embodied objects, yet they are the mechanism that creates the virtual image. So there must be some relationship, something like you can't detach the virtual from the material, and that's kind of present in our eyes and in our bodies.
I got involved with a neuroscientist named Vittorio Galassi, and Vittorio discovered the mirror neuron. The mirror neuron was they did an experiment with monkeys, and they gave the monkey a peanut, and they assessed his reaction to it. And there was one point where another monkey pulled the peanut, and the monkeys that were assessing reacted as if took the peanut itself. And they start from this to kind of think about the relationship to empathy, and how we can experience, the monkeys, birds, and human beings can experience or can have empathy with the experience of somebody else without going through the experience. And we started to work, they have the lab in Parma, about going through an MRI machine and looking at digital images and looking at them at different resolution to try and figure out if they're evoking any haptic experience, the desire to touch that is coming, comes through resolution. And I have this kind of feeling that the preoccupation that we have with resolution, often we have to attribute it to the industry. So Taube company constantly want to push the next model because of revenues. But I have a feeling that the desire for higher resolution is a great desire that we have to an haptic experience to somehow attain the there-ness of the world. And this kind of desire to create an image is coming from this. And all the technologies are constantly, and I'm interested from the monocular perspective in the Renaissance, the invention of the lens, and the camera is allowing to fix this image in an automatic way and constantly somehow moving into a more and more natural representation, and now moving into a completely an hyperreal spaces where there is a collapse of virtual images, resolution. We can watch, like the image from NASA, we can experience things that happening, that happened millions and millions of years ago in such distances. But somehow we're constantly striving to something that to assurance that something actually existing. And so anyway, we started to work on those experiments. At the moment, it's on hold, but this idea and relationship between looking at a photograph and actually feeling it as a physical, essential engagement with it. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about your relationship to sound and how you choose the music to accompany your work?
So, in some of my work, the sound, I couldn't show too many of the films, but I filmed this work in the forest in Ukraine, and there the sound was created on location. In most of the films that I show here, all the sound is actually Foley, so it's created post to the film, but it tends to take elements that are existing in the film and just start to stretch them. One of the things that interests me always about the sound is to conceive it as a landscape. So when we do the recording or the collection of the Foley, there will be different distances and proximity from the event. So there will be moments that are actually connecting to it. So if we look at the drop of water, there may be some relationship to an ocean, and there may be, so the micro and the macro will also kind of play part and will create a space that will somehow resonate with the event that is taking place. It's impossible almost to do actually recording on those sets, because in some of them, the sound around that we have, because it's a contained space, creates so much disturbances that it's impossible to use. I always will collect some of those sounds and maybe embed some of them in the film, but it's impossible to actually make a soundtrack on the location itself, in the contained film. When you look at the last film with the drop of water, when you see the actual drop falling, it's falling into the lid of a mineral water bottle. So we are so close there. So the space is very close, so there are noises of movement around that recording any actual sound in real time is becoming virtually impossible. Yes.
I'm thinking about memory in relation to your work, and I'm wondering what it would be like to see this, for instance, in a museum where it would be on repeat, and for instance, the mirror, the vases and the mirrors, and I'm wondering what kind of influence it might have, because it's interesting how when I was looking at the collapse, it felt like I was kind of looking at a scene of catastrophe, right? There was, especially the noises, the breaking glasses, they all made me think of they all echoed different sounds that I might associate with a war scene or a bomb scene, and it's and I'm interested how those come unbidden to my ears when I look at your work, and how seeing it on repeat might change that experience, because it might also kind of then play out some of the memories that I was able to develop in looking at your work, so that the memories that I didn't necessarily bring from outside, but that I was able to kind of create in the space of your work. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if that is a choice that you make in exhibiting it in an official space. Repetition is something that you might be using in exhibiting these different productions?
So the repetition of, again?
So like, you know, in exhibiting this in a museum, would you be kind of putting this on repeat for audiences to see it again and again?
Yeah, it's keep going on a loop. I mean, just endless cycles. And then, you know, it's very difficult because when I show this work, I see them, I want them to be just visual experiences and to remove a little bit myself from them. The association of making them, and so when I make a talk, I constantly bring all these relationship and association. Those exploding mirrors, I encounter them in the Kunsthistorias in Vienna. And the relationship between, you know, the museum was built and all the Ringstrasse was finished on the eve of the First World War. So the Austrian-Hungarian Empire just finished building this, you know, kind of very exuberant architectural and kind of demonstrated the greatness of the empire without really being completely oblivious to the political tensions that exist, and as soon as it finished, the whole thing kind of falls apart. And there is something about the Bruegel paintings that were hanging there from those times that is so exuberant and so rich, and I kind of, for me, when I visited, there was this association between what these paintings are and the history of this building. And I was also thinking about the Crystal Knight and the way by destroying glass, it's almost there is an attempt to erase culture. So how I'm, you know, breaking it, and what are the consequences of breaking glass with this sound. And then there are association to war, and I kind of, it's become a build-up of various associations that are layers, but they're only my motivation, of course, to make the work. Now I talk, so I can reveal them or make references to them. When I put them in front of the viewer, I mean, the associations that you make now to disaster, to war, and talking about memory, it's things that that I'm very much, you know, hoping that the work is charged with, and it will be evocative for the viewer to start to experience them. And what I'm even hoping more, I mean, and when you're looking at this film or any of the work, I always think about the relationship in this film between prose and poetry, and they're much, you know, they're very much in the territory of poetry, so there is no linearity, and they keep on going in a loop. And the level, the layer of experience, or the way they present themselves, is very, very open. And those associations, like a lot of others, are all possibilities that I very much, you know, hope that if you are patient and kind to look at the work, may experience. Yes. Sorry?
Sorry. The pieces that you showed on reflection and the one with the two portraits, for me, kind of deal with themes of rebirth, whether it's like rebirth of like a person who's long dead or rebirth of nature. Whereas I think of photography and video as ways of recapturing what was once alive and turning into something that's inert and kind of dead. So I've kind of seen photography as a way, as kind of a tragic thing in that way. Do you kind of see to change or transform the identity of photography and video and turn it into more of a process of rebirth in that way?
In my still photographs, and again, I just show a limited number of work, focus on a particular angle of the work, but I did, for example, a series of photographs of olive trees, and I photographed them in Palestinian villages in the Galilee that now are part of the state of Israel. And those trees that I photographed are the oldest that existing in Israel, so they're between 300 and 500 years old. And they were living there before the occupation, before First World War, before the occupation of the Ottomans, before the British Mandate, before the entire conflict. And they are really at the heart of the conflict that's existing. So settlers will try to uproot them in order to reclaim the land, and for the Palestinians it will be a kind of an evidence or right for the land. And there are all these kind of levels on different narratives that are existing. And what I done when I photographed, again with an analog camera, I went in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the day, where the sun and the light were really blazing in such a way that you can't photograph in Israel around this time. In August at 12 o'clock noon, it's a time that just there is so much flare. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to use the light, which is the source of creation, and to turn it into the violent source of distraction. So my initial idea was that I'll just leave the camera open for a very long time, and I will allow light to enter the film, and the light will register information on the film, and it keep on doing it because more and more light is coming. And what happened then is new information upon new information upon new information, there start to be process of recalling and erasing. And then when I come to the darkroom with these films, and I process them, they're absolutely black, and you put them on a light box, so you look through the light and you can't see anything through them. So then I go into the enlarger and I print them on a piece of paper for a very long period of time, trying somehow to retrieve or to save traces of the images. And I produce a whole series of images that are about, destruction and creation that are happening on the film. And they are straight photographs. They represent reality that was very different again from my mundane one, standing beside the camera. Both of us were looking at the same tree. My experience and what came out were so far apart, and for me it was a real question of where reality is occurring, but also these images are becoming a process of recalling and erasing. So constantly there is, when you talk about death and rebirth and creation, it exists in a single photograph that is creating over time. And in a way coming close to the process of painting or a drawing, where there is the time of the image rather than just what the image represents. So, coming back to your question, it's existing in the film, and I think that it also exists in many of my still photographs. This kind of process of becoming or transforming, or the exploding flower. There is a moment where something falls apart, but actually it's the moment where the image is being captured and being preserved forever. So it's also being, the moment of something coming to life. It's and it's a moment that's happening in the fold of time, in a moment that almost doesn't exist, and all of and kind of getting these almost a real pathos and physical presence that is 8 foot tall by so.
Much of your photography is a reflection and interaction with Western mimetic tradition, with naturalistic painting. I wonder if there are other non-mimetic traditions, Near Eastern, Islamic, medieval, that work with some of the same ideas you're engaged with, that you find inspiration.
So I'll tell you, it's true that my work is very deeply rooted in the European tradition, and I was brought up in Israel, and I live with this kind of tension and paradoxes because I was brought up in the Middle East, but my entire upbringing was fed by the European tradition and legacy. And my generation of people that arrived to Israel, I learned and we studied French literature and Russian literature. I didn't have any access in school, which I regret and resent, but this was the reality of when you talk about the neighboring countries and the great traditions that exist aesthetically and in terms of literature. So, it's not a coincidence that I find myself in Europe, and I'm responding to, I suppose, to my own roots. There is something biographical about, this pictorial language, and it's. For me, it's kind of it's always puzzling because I have strong affinity to Israel, and I understand shifts that need to happen there because of its geography and the legacy of where, my family arrived or how they arrived to Israel, and the desire to make it into something else. And I'm sort of torn apart, and I understand that something completely had to transform in terms of influences, and yet I'm so alien to them in many ways because, I was brought up on a particular kind of legacy that became mine. I almost, so when I come to Europe, that's where I really feel at home in a peculiar way. And the work is kind of responding to, responding or reflecting upon this. I don't know if I answer, but it's about, there is something about all these works that I can talk about it in historical context, but before anything, it's a autobiographical reflection on my experiences and my connection to so there is no attempt here to to make or to establish a sort of views that is outside of my remit.
So maybe one last question, if someone has one.
Yes.
I was wondering to what extent you deliberately wanted to use the camera to visualize philosophical issues about reality, about truth, about moral. To what extent was that part of your goal as an artist?
Yeah, I think that this is at the heart of it. I try to make sense. Like I said before, I try to make sense of my my stand in the world, my position, my moral grounding, and the way I kind of explore these issues is with the use of the camera. And whenever I lift the camera, because there is always a question that I ask myself, why to take another photograph? There are so many of them, and at the same time I have this great impulse by a fascination or desire of a particular image that start to haunt me, and also these issues that are really kind of that I'm struggling with and I'm puzzled by, and kind of a desire to make myself better or to make the world better, and constantly failing to do so, and engaging with the camera in some sort of desperate attempt to come close to reality. And the camera is a mediating tool that allow me to come closer and always stay so far from it, or something of this kind. So yeah, it is, I could say, the camera become a philosophical tool. It's a relationship that it's allowing me to establish a relationship with my existing in the world, and this kind of tension and dialogues that we have create whatever comes out that is it is what it is.
All right, thank you.